Hi, welcome everyone to day 4 of the SFLIG conference. We're here with a panel of presentations regarding SFL and education. We're going to hear 3 talks during this session from Sharon Besser and Ruslana Westerlund, and then Natalia Rios and Vanina Nera. And so we'll start the session now with Sharon and Ruslana's paper. Over to you.
Welcome and thank you so much, Catherine, for kicking us off. And we invite everyone to follow our presentation. This study just wanted to, in a way of introducing ourselves. My name is Ruslana Westerlund, and we were doing this study when I was part of the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. And this study has actually been published. So if you want to access our paper, you can scan the QR code on the left, and actually it will take you straight to the paper. If you don't want to go there now, the link to the presentation is in the references at the end, and it's also, we can put it in the chat if you are having a hard time finding it. So with that, Sharon.
Right, so I'm Sharon Besser, and when I did this study with Ruslana, I was working as a professor of education at Edgewood College in Wisconsin, and now I am working in curriculum design for EL education. And we're thrilled to be able to share this with you.
Yes, all right. So, okay.
So this is related to our title of our presentation. This is where this comes from. And the work, the study was done about a curriculum called Bringing History to Life, which is from Teachers College Units of Study. And you can see in the upper right-hand column, that's the curriculum booklet, and it was for grade 4. And then this is our favorite piece of data. The script includes many metaphors, and this was one of them. Writing is a little bit like sledding. This slide was actually created by the teachers implementing the curriculum, and they brought in the image, but the writing is directly from the script. So as you can see, writing is divided into 3 parts: walk up the hill, get ready on the top of the hill, and sled. And we are from Wisconsin, so at least for us, this kind of made sense. Anyway, Ruslana, go ahead to the next slide.
Yeah. So the context for our study, as Sharon mentioned, was that unit. In terms of student demographics context, this was in a suburban K-12 school district with ELL population of English language learners, or multilingual students. We use those terms interchangeably. Is 13.7% in the district, and 30.4% of those students are on free and reduced price lunch. In terms of the school where the study took place, ELLs made up about 22% of the entire school population, and 40% were on free and reduced price lunch. And I was working with that school district on disciplinary literacy, and that's when we discovered that the district adopted Lucy Calkins teaching materials, especially writing units of study, and they were seeking support on how to support ELL students writing in the disciplines. So when we set up the study and this inquiry, the following data sources were used. First, we definitely, I actually have a copy right here of the Bringing History to Life, the actual teacher script that the teachers follow with fidelity, which is very important in this curriculum. We collected field notes of student participation in the classroom and the classroom discourse, which included teacher classroom discourse in whole class and also the conferencing in small groups. We also had studied and analyzed teacher PowerPoint slides, which basically were created by a curriculum or literacy coach that wanted to create uniformity of implementation of Lucy Calkins. So they translated the unit of study for Bringing History to Life, about 200 pages of text, into a PowerPoint slide deck, and then the teachers in the district were following that that slide deck as their content and organizational structure for teaching. We collected student work, and also we had we also interviewed our teacher in this 4th grade classroom.
So the theoretical framework we chose is based on legitimation code theory, LCT, based on the work of Carl Mayton. And we chose this framework particularly for the 3 points that are here on this slide, and that enabled us to see how knowledge is built in a context. And the context we were looking at was the implementation of this curriculum and the curriculum itself. And the framework helps us reveal the rules of the game about how to succeed. For example, how do you know what the teacher wants? And it also helps us reveal the basis of achievement that underlies educational practice. And in our experience, and I'm sure yours as well, these are often unwritten and unspoken, and can be accessible sometimes only to students from specific backgrounds, and they might generate social inequality. We also want to shout out to the North American LCT community who really helped us kind of make sense of this framework, particularly Michael Monty and Jody Martin. So thank you for that, and I hope we do it justice here.
Yes, they were very helpful with lots of questions and lots of back and forth, but it was what an incredible community for LCT North America. So in terms of within LCT, there are many translation devices, and basically what translation device means, it's an approach of analyzing data and then using the data to speak back to the theory. So we chose specialization dimension. There is autonomy, semantic density, and many other devices within the LCT framework. And we chose specialization codes that help us really shed light on the data. And the specialization dimension is best represented through this Cartesian plane. So in the left, upper left corner, we have the knowledge code. And that basically means that it's not necessarily what is and what isn't, but it is what's emphasized, or what is the focal point. So within this upper left corner, it's specialized knowledge of genres, knowledge of writing conventions, knowledge of language is being emphasized, or the basis of achievement, and the attributes of students are downplayed. Then opposite from it is the specialized knowledge is not as significant, but instead the knower and the attributes of students are emphasized as the basis of achievement. Then in this upper right corner, it's the elite code. That what's emphasized there is to have very unique specialist knowledge, and being a particular kind of knower is the basis of achievement. And then this one, it's sort of like anything goes. Neither specialist knowledge nor knower attributes are emphasized. And what's important to know about applying specialization device, or actually any devices within LCT, is to look at not as a dichotomy, but it's more like a plane, because within the process of instruction and teaching and learning, particular areas are emphasized and particular areas are downplayed. So it's sort of a wave or a plane of various emphases within. So that's how we used this particular device, and then we're going to be using this device with you as we present our data. So now we're going to go to, actually, I'm going to take us to the data itself. And if you want to have access to this table, you can have this short URL. So 1 second, it will just be a second of transition, because I have to click out of one and go to another. here we are. So Sharon, take us through this and talk about how our data played out on this Cartesian plane.
So this is our, as Ruslan has explained, this is our translation device, and we base this on work from Maton and Chen, who use something really similar. And as you can see, this helped us really to figure out how to frame and analyze our data. So on the left, we looked at the curriculum, and we have two parts that we looked at: the content knowledge of the grade for informational writing, and then the teaching of the content knowledge. And we have these, the codes that you just saw, ER minus, ER positive. And then we have the indicators for those codes. So for example, in this first one, the ER negative codes refer to when knowledge of writing as a process or knowledge of history content. And sometimes often those were together. And then further to the right is what that looked like in the data. So the examples of the data of when knowledge of writing is a process would be writing is thinking, planning, drafting, and talking. So when we saw that in the data, we coded that as ER negative or ER minus. And then if it was knowledge of history content, it was like a mini lesson focused on content, like the teacher might have asked, what do you know about the Ho chunk? Then on the far right was where we ended up, and we worked with this table kind of back and forth all the way through the research process and the writing. So we use these codes to do our data analysis coding, but then we also use this right column to come up with implication and findings that were related to achievement. So for example, in this, when we saw something that was coded as ER negative, that was also in terms of what the achievement looked like that was expected was, for example, students are expected to participate in the process. I realize this is a lot to kind of throw at you, but we're going to show you some examples. So Ruslan, can you just go down to the SR positive and we'll just show kind of what that looks like?
Yep.
So we have the epistemal relations, which is the ER, and the social relationships here. And for us, the concept of this was this writer identity in the grade 4 writing workshop. And when it was SR positive, what it looked like was then when writer identity was based on participation in the activities and also the individual's role in the community. And so the examples from the data would be if the teacher said, wow, you wrote so much, that's referring to their participation, or you're such great writers, again, referring to their identity. And then in terms of achievement, it's who the writer is and what they are like is kind of the basis of achievement if it's SR positive. So let's go on and look at some of the framing. And if we need to kind of go back to this, let's do that.
Okay, I'll go back to the slide, which is gonna just take me a second.
While she's doing that, what I didn't show you was kind of the opposites of the SR negative, what that would look like, and the ER positive, what that would look like. And we'll show you that in the data.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Sharon. I saw a few of you have access to links, so that's great. You can have that. So based on the framing that we just described, our main inquiry was, what is the basis of achievement in the caucus units of study, which is translated into these research questions. What kind of student is considered, what kind of student is considered a good student in the Calkins Writers Workshop? What kind of student is set up to succeed? And what kind of student is set up to fail? And basically, because the student needs are neglected as a result of the curriculum, and who has access to the knowledge and who doesn't. So here
we're gonna show you some data, and on the left is the script from the curriculum, and on the right is what our teachers said during the mini lesson that was related to the curriculum. And what we noticed is there was a lot of fidelity in between what the script said and what the teacher said and what the slide deck said. And we looked at all of those kind of simultaneously, but we just wanted to show these ones to you. So what the script said here that related to that was, how did the writer probably go about making that? I wonder if chefs looked at finished cakes and tried to figure out the recipe for those cakes, because that's a bit what writers need to do. We need to look at Naomi's finished work and try to figure out how she made it and how we could go about making something sort of similar. Let's start then by noticing some things about the first chapter. So there's a mentor text that they're looking at here. And it goes on, will you scan this section and try to figure out how she organized her information? While you do that, will you also figure out what you might need to do today during today's writing workshop to write a section like this in your book tomorrow? Work with each other. So then what we observed was the teacher said, what are you noticing about this type of writing?
It's long.
It's pretty long. Honestly, you guys might end up writing an essay this long.
Essay. Every 5 seconds, you gotta do an essay.
What do you see in nonfiction book?
Headings.
What else do you notice?
Something up on top.
What else do we notice?
Words.
Words. We see words.
We see multiple paragraphs in each section.
This is a good place to stop. Go back to your desk and write things you notice. How does she know when to start a new paragraph? How does she know when to start a new chapter? So this was an example of data that we coded as ER minus. And that's because it was, to us, a very clean example of a discovery-based way of kind of looking for knowledge based on, again, what the students see. And it wasn't particularly based on, here's the structure of the piece of writing. I'm going to help you outline it. It was very much, again, as you can see, what do you notice? What do you notice? What do you notice?
And also I want to add that there was no guidance of the noticings. So it was very open-ended and sort of put the kids like, what are we looking for here? And no guidance or feedback provided to the teacher to direct their attention to particular genre that they were actually studying. This purpose was actually to study the genre, but it wasn't done in a guided way. It was just like that. What do you notice? What do you notice? And then now you will be writing this kind of writing. So let's look at one more piece of data. 1 second. Okay, so this one, we coded as ER minus SR plus because it was actually quite tricky. We had first thought it was ER plus because the knowledge of writing, both either chronologically or categorically, there was an intention to say, oh, these types of genres that you are writing have a particular organizational structure. And some of them are organized chronologically and some of them would be organized categorically. So the teacher had this slide, and then the students were holding this time a mentor text in front of them, which was indeed very long. It was about 5 pages long, and it was a 4th grade classroom to have a 5-page long mentor text. So then the teacher asked the students, which one did Ms. Peterson do? Ms. Peterson was the person who wrote the mentor text. And the student says,
categorically, because you put everything in categories.
But categories are not organized in a timeline.
She started talking about now and then last.
Whatever info you think it's important for someone who doesn't know about the Ho-Chunk, your job as a historical writer is to give your reader info about the Ho-Chunk. It's easier to do chronological. Today's big goal is to write. I want you to leave with as much writing as you can. Your hands are gonna hurt. Write down everything you know. Use your notes, your notebook, use Ms. Peterson's text. You are trying to write chapter 1. So while at first, like I said, there was this chronological categorical knowledge building, it wasn't really built up, because the teacher's saying, you basically, if you have the knowledge about the Ho-Chang, go ahead and write it. So then the SR plus was where it was a particular kind of knower was emphasized, the knower who already knew the content knowledge and who could translate that content knowledge into the written mode automatically, as if knowledge in the content area translates automatically into vast linguistic resources that are needed for the written mode. So let's look at one more piece of data, unless Sharon, you have anything to add to this.
Let's go to the next one.
Okay.
So this next one occurred after, so the slide we just showed you, then they had 20 minutes to write. And then they were gathered back to the front of the room. And this slide in the middle was what was up there, which in the slide in the middle says, wow, you wrote so much. How can we make it a bit better? So the script that kind of went with this, as you can see, says, writers, shake out your hands. Nice work. Now I want you to think of a few things that might nudge you to do even better. And it kind of goes on there, but let's focus on what the teacher said.
Okay, I can be the teacher. The teacher says, you should have gotten some sentences written. If you didn't get sentences written, you didn't get sentences written. If you have them written, now look at these transition words. Look what you wrote and see where you can add these in.
So when we were watching this, what we saw is some of the students came to this part of the lesson with, 2 or 3 pages written in their notebooks, and other students came with 1 sentence or even less than that. So in order to kind of do this next part of the lesson, which was putting in these transition words, you needed to have a bunch of text written in order to do this. So this sort of only applied to some of the kids, but what struck us more was the value on the volume, this, wow, you wrote so much. And the fact that this slide had been created and used before even seeing what the students were going to write. So we thought that was, so that's why we coded this as SR positive. So it really was about, again, not what they wrote, the organizational structure that was the sort of the focus of the lesson, but the volume. And you had to have that volume in order to even participate. But again, it's ER minus instead of ER positive. ER positive would have been really direct instruction on how to do those transition words, but that wasn't here. This was just, if you can do it, put it in. If not, that's okay. And that was kind of that way of the sort of presenting these little bits of technical knowledge as kind of optional things that the students could choose to put in if it was appropriate, was sort of how it kind of went for most of the unit. Ruslana, did you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, something just to add to what you said about the wow, you wrote so much, that of course it was a pre-built slide and it was used by all teachers regardless of whether the entire district, and in our classroom didn't matter what you wrote. And we particularly were concerned about our focal student. We're not talking about that student exactly her data today, but we did study her and how she didn't have this slide, wow, you wrote so much, didn't apply to her. And but it did privilege other kids who had volume written. And then the student with very little writing, literally there was 3 words on a page, she was left out of this teaching. And she was being kept behind, more and more behind as the lessons progressed. So let's talk about, in general, our findings from our study.
So after we coded the data, we kind of plotted it along this plane, and and noted that most of it occurred in the knower code plane. So that meant most of the data was coded as ER minus and SR positive. So what that meant was that the process of writing and the participation was privileged over the technical knowledge. So what was privileged was thinking and planning and drafting and volumes and talking. And that what counted as achievement for the students was this participation, was this how you did the process. It didn't matter how much knowledge you learned, but were you able to figure out what you were supposed to do that day? And that day that we were talking about, you were just supposed to write a lot. So that was kind of how these findings were. Rue, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it was a particular knower that was privileged here, marked as SR plus, because it was a knower who wrote volumes. And that was very obvious through all of the data, and those who had less volume or less participation in the process were not counted.
Exactly. So we've got some findings summarized here. And also, I would encourage you, again, if you have time to look back at the table, which sort of has on that right-hand column, the measures of achievement. That's an important part of the findings too. But basically, to kind of summarize, what we noticed about writing is how it's presented as this cognitive process of thinking, planning, and particularly noticing what's going on in the piece of writing. And the main work of the writing is drafting and free writing. And then related to the SR positive, the writer is empowered to make choices. And this is an important part of the sort of the ethos of the curriculum. Choices about aspect of topic and organizational structure. However, we noticed that these choices were limited, and the teacher would privilege certain choices in implicit ways, like the example in the data with the categorical or chronological structure. She was pushing the kids to this chronological structure. And so you didn't really have a choice between the two. The other important finding about knowledge of writing is that it was really conceptualized as a set of transferable skills. So if you can draft here in this one context, you're meant to be able to do it in another. So there wasn't a lot of regard for genre and what it requires to write in a discipline, and that kind of just general knowledge about drafting and thinking was privileged over knowledge of language resources, and resources particularly that would apply to write certain genres. And this genre was informational writing, as I think we've said.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And what's interesting about these findings is that we had another slide. We actually hit it because of the shortness of time. But what I wanted to add is that these findings were actually validated through the previous critiques of process writing. That process writing is a very prolific way of teaching writing in a lot of US contexts, especially as opposed to sociocultural and social process of writing, where it's really Vygotskian mediation of knowledge by participation with more knowledgeable other, and mediation of tools and language as building resources for becoming a writer versus being born a writer and just producing volumes. So it was actually quite exciting for us to see that our findings really were echoing the previous critiques by Highland and Delpit and Copen Calantis and Andres Ramirez, and a lot of previous folks who have critiqued. And those critiques are actually well elaborated in our paper. So you can see how our findings are similar to what previously has been discovered in terms of, and especially particularly important for students from backgrounds other than the mainstream sort of middle class, white, privileged backgrounds. So the implications are quite serious. We found that the curriculum, even though it's very popular and it's used in thousands of schools in the US and internationally, it does result in systematic denial of the opportunity to explicitly teach the students about the technical knowledge of writing. And especially when you bring in the systemic functional linguistics perspective, which is the main group that put on this conference, development of language in literacy is the development of linguistic resources. Students need to effectively participate and communicate their knowledge in the written mode. And that knowledge of what are the language resources needed to learn to translate your knowledge into a different mode were not explicitly made at all, because everything was about just participation in the process and not learning the vast resources that the written mode demands. Also, this curriculum resulted in the lack of opportunity to develop students. Sorry, I already said that. Well, at least I agree with myself, so that's good. And further, this leads to the greatest potential consequence for multilingual students, and really how the language resources in their second language or third are not being developed to write, because the overall ethos of this teaching curriculum is based on individual discovery. Achievement is based on prior knowledge of language and genre, and access to the knowledge necessary for achievement is not distributed equally. And in this way, we found that the bringing history to life script to be potentially complicit in both creating and maintaining achievement gaps in writing development, as the students who make progress do so because they did not need help from the teacher, and the ones who need explicit language teaching to make progress did not get enough support.
So we go back to our opening here. So we just thought this was just not only just a very popular metaphor that was kind of metaphors throughout the curriculum, but for what our findings, particularly because while writing might be a little bit like sledding for some, right? For some kids, all they need to do is get on the top of the hill and go, or decide what to write and just write. But only for some kids, and particularly probably for kids who get to experience this lovely, white, snowy world, which at least in what we found was a lot, again, so it seems like the group that is privileged here is the white middle class students who who writing is easy and a little bit like sledding, but for everyone else, writing is a lot of work, and it requires explicit attention, and it requires a lot of teaching. And so it's unfortunate that this kind of metaphor is being permeated throughout the curriculum, because we really feel that it's kind of creating a system where there's not a lot of equity and achievement.
Right. So these were the references that were mentioned here in just this presentation today, and our paper is on the bottom. It's available for download without needing journal subscription. And we can take some time for questions now. We actually have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. And while the floor is open, I'll just invite the audience to just take a moment to thank our first presenters in the session for that just really interesting kickoff to the discussion. So who would like to offer the first question or comment or reaction? Oh, it gets to be me. Perfect. Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in just highlighting the popularity of this approach. But I wonder what do you think makes it so popular? Why does it have such staying power? Despite these kind of observations you're making about its limitations and the goals of schooling, like why is it around?
Well, I'll start if that's okay, Rusana. What I actually taught this curriculum for several years, and what teachers like and what I liked is it's lovely at creating a community. It's very encouraging and positive in terms of, because you get to value things that the students can do. And also it's, if I might say, it's pretty easy to teach because it doesn't require a lot of knowledge about language or genre, because that's not really part of it. So it's easy to feel kind of confident as a teacher in using this, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's popular. And there's a community of a huge community of teachers who use it and get professional development together. And teachers really need a sense of belonging. And so that's this curriculum kind of gives them that.
Yeah, I also want to add that I think having a script that's broken up by lessons takes the burden off the planning, because teachers are very, very busy. And it's having this already and having website resources and all the lessons and a community to share resources and follow a script is another appealing feature. Yes, Kelly. Hi.
Hello, hi, thank you. This is wonderful. I would also add that some teachers and districts in the early adoption, when this first started coming out, it's been a long time, it was a nice shift from the old-fashioned basal readers, where students were just given reading was, you read part of a story and you answer the questions at the end of the text. And then writing, as we all remember, was kind of like worksheets and stuff. Like 20 years ago, when, some of us are older, and especially in urban contexts, that there wasn't any kind of curricular resource. So it was at least a step in the right direction. That said, I also work with teachers who I'm coaching right now in a small district, and the teachers who teach Teachers College asked me for help. And so this is great. They will be reading this article soon. I think it will validate their experiences. So thank you for your work. I, of course, am moving them toward kind of a genre approach, but I'm finding even right now they're writing, they call it, what do they call it? Like a recount. And so when I ask them, like, so are you doing a personal recount about a stormy day? Because it has to be about bad weather. Or is it like a fictional story that takes place within some bad weather? And the teachers weren't even able to articulate that for me. And they have a lot of newcomers, a whole bunch from Brazil this year. And so I also asked, well, how are you exploring what bad weather is? Because for some of the Brazilian students, maybe it's a mudslide, and this whole conversation about blizzards is like, they can't even imagine it. So they raised the question, and then my questions raised even more questions, but I'm finding that I'm having a hard time hooking onto something because the curriculum doesn't even make it clear what exactly genre they're writing, although they would call it genre based. It's not very specific. It's just a recount. So thank you for your work, and I would love to see some optional units developed.
Well, thank you, Kelly. We've noticed this as well with our work with teachers. Just identifying what the genre is super tricky, and particularly with the units of study where it's not very clear and that hasn't been articulated very well. Ruslan and I did a follow-up study to this, which we haven't written about yet, but will be soon, where we actually used a genre-based pedagogy to teach one of these units. And so we did the teaching and learning cycle for literary essay, and did it alongside the same unit of study. And so we will hopefully get that out soon.
it was great to follow up with the same teacher when we were teaching the literary theme interpretation essay with the teacher in the same classroom, because she saw the power of, and she said, why are we still using these units if there is this way, and why don't we know another way that made sharing of resources and knowledge more visible and equally distributed. That was kind of the big thing, the equal distribution and access to the knowledge of the written mode, language resources, how are they equally distributed is kind of the passion we are pursuing in our research.
Well, thank you again both so much. And I'm glad we had a little bit of extra time actually for extended discussion here. We're going to turn the floor over now to our second and third presenters of today, who are sharing with us in two different pairings, two examples of the work that they've been getting into. Natalia and Vanina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We cannot share the screen at the moment because the other presentation is still there. Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right. Just a second, sorry. Okay.
Okay, so hello everyone. Natalia Rios and I will be presenting our preliminary findings in a study of chronicles in primary schools. We have been analyzing processes and circumstances. And well, to start with, we'd like to show you an overview of our presentation. We'll start by showing you the context in which we will be working. And then we're going to move on to the objectives, the theoretical framework, the literature review, and then the methodology. And then we will refer to the findings and the discussion and some contributions and implications of our study. Well, this is related to what the previous presenters have been talking about. We've found that in our context, a great number of primary school students experience great difficulties in writing and in reading, as is evidenced in Aprender, which is an assessment, a national assessment program that measures the achievement of primary school students and secondary school students. In particular, in the primary school, students are first introduced to disciplinary texts. So the development of the skills of reading and writing are of great concern for teachers and researchers. So the ability to understand and produce disciplinary texts is related to understanding how knowledge is constructed and negotiated in the disciplines. And the mastery of school genres does not occur naturally, but it generally needs to be taught systematically. We are part of a wider project in which, well, the first step was to analyze school textbooks and to develop then material to implement the Reading to Learn program. So our objective in this paper is to explore and describe the types of processes and circumstances that are typically found in historical recounts and accounts of a 5th grade primary school textbook. And we are going to use the information that we acquire here to develop materials for teaching these genres. So our study is based on the Reading to Learn program, which was designed in the framework of systemic functional linguistics. And this program accompanies the student to achieve the necessary tools to access specific disciplinary contexts through the deconstruction, modeling, production of prototypical disciplinary texts. And so we are going to study these disciplinary texts in order to guide this process of deconstruction, modeling, and production. Well, the disciplinary texts to work on are selected for their role in the syllabus, and well, they are chosen as they are related to specific subjects. And the approach involves focusing on different levels: the genre, the stages, the phases, and the sentences. And the focus will depend on the teacher's objectives and the student's needs. Well, this is just a revision of, well, the Reading to Learn program is based on 3 main theories: the education linguistics, Halliday and Martin, social linguistic theory of Bernstein, and social cultural theory of learning of Vygotsky. The previous presenters have already mentioned this, the interaction with a more knowledgeable other in order to build knowledge of the disciplines in this case. Okay, the Reading to Learn program has shown good results in contributing to closing the gap between high and low achievers. And some countries in which this program has been carried out include Australia, where it was first developed, then Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, and other countries of Latin America. Well, as regards the methodology, we worked with 10 chronicles of historical events, and these included recounts and accounts, and they belong to a 5th grade primary school textbook, which is the most popular textbook in our province. And the selection of the corpus was based on the definitions of the historical recount genre as a type of historical narrative whose overall purpose is to retell events in the past. So in this kind of genre, the focus is on chronology, and then on the historical account genre, which is a type of historical narrative whose overall purpose is to explain historical events. So in this case, apart from the development through time, causality is also included. Well, the texts were classified and selected according to their overall purpose and their schematic structure. And we analyzed 2 elements of the transitivity system: the processes and the circumstances. We identified the processes and classified them into 6 types, and according to their meaning and the participants. When we were in doubt, we looked at the participants that were part of that process. And in the case of circumstances, they were classified into 8 types according to their meaning and their realization as well. In the next slide, we have, well, a list of a table which summarizes all the process types, both including main process types and minor process types. As regards the circumstances, well, the circumstances are elements of the clause that provide additional, frequently optional information about the process, and they are typically realized by adverb groups and prepositional phrases. And some of the meanings that the semantic types that we classified were time, place, manner, including means, quality, and degree, manner, including comparison, and cause, including reason, and cause purpose. So we used the categories which were more appropriate for the type of texts that we were dealing with. And well, now we move on to the findings and discussion.
Yes, so the analysis showed that more than 60% of the processes used in both historical recounts and historical accounts are material processes, followed by relational processes with 23% of the cases in historical recounts and 18% of the occurrences in historical accounts. There were few instances of mental and verbal processes as shown in the graphs. On this slide, we have included some extracts of the historical recounts analyzed. And the processes which are highlighted in blue are material processes. And this type of processes serve to recount the sequence of historical events. For example, 4.000 hombres zarparon desde Valparaíso, las expediciones desembarcaron, landed in English, al sur de Lima, y desde allí avanzaron, continued, hacia la capital. Relational processes, which are highlighted in orange, are mainly used to provide background information about the topic. For example, la revolución industrial fue un proceso que marcó un antes y un después. So the revolution was a process. And as I said before, material processes are also the main type of processes used in historical accounts as they narrate the main events. For example, durante la Revolución Francesa estalló una guerra en Europa. So a war broke out. Las tropas francesas combatieron. And relational processes with 18% of the cases serve to describe some participants in the main events. For example, ¿qué es una colonia? So what is a colony? Es un territorio, it is a territory. There were few instances of mental processes. For example, Liniers decidió, so Liniers decided to organize la reconquista. El rey rechazó el pedido, refused. And a few instances of verbal processes. For example, Liniers le pidió, so he requested. Good. So let's move on now to the circumstance variable. In this case, the most frequently type of circumstances used in historical recounts are temporal circumstances, highlighted in blue, and then circumstances of place, highlighted in red, with 22% of the occurrences, and then manner, with almost 15% of the cases. We notice that most of the circumstances of time are thematized and thus serve to organize the texts with a chronological method of development. For example, en 1806, en junio de aquel año, in June of that year, tres días después, 3 days later. And the examples of circumstances of place are en Quilmes, in the city of Buenos Aires, etc. And in the case of historical accounts, both circumstances of time and place are the prevailing type of circumstances. For example, a fines de 1773, highlighted in blue, el 4 de julio de 1776, and circumstances of place such as al mar and en Europa, in Europe. Then we found circumstances of cause, including reason and purpose, with almost 19% of the cases. Circumstances of time and place construe the realization of the processes, which are mainly material here, while circumstances of reason and purpose are the resources to express causality within the clause. For example, en respuesta a esta provocación. And in relation to the realization of the circumstances, in the case of historical recounts, they are realized mainly by prepositional phrases, which are circled in yellow. So, for example, en 1789, en julio de 1821, contra el poder absoluto del rey. Then 20% of the realizations are adverbial groups, which are circled in red. For example, después, poco después, soon after, and only 5% of the circumstances are realized by nominal groups. For example, el día 28. Then in historical accounts, again, the most frequent realization of causal relations are, the most frequent realization of circumstances are also prepositional phrases, highlighted in yellow. And these circumstances can realize a variety of circumstance types. For example, a fines de 1773, at the end of 1773, which is a temporal circumstance, or circumstances of place. For example, en Europa, in Europe. And nominal groups, which are circled in blue, express circumstances of time mainly. For example, on July the 4th, 1776. And then adverbial groups with 15% of the cases tend to express circumstances of manner. For example, they are circled in red. For example, successfully, economically, and militarmente. So the contributions and implications of this study are that in both historical accounts and recounts, most processes are material followed by relational processes. And in historical accounts, circumstances express firstly the time when the process is actualized, and secondly, the place where it is actualized. In historical recounts, circumstances of time and location are followed by circumstances of cause. And we believe that students would profit from being explicitly taught how writers construe processes and circumstances and how these are used to organize clauses and texts. These are the references, and thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We have another presentation where we'll be hearing from you as well, but I wonder if we want to pause here for a little bit of discussion or connection to the first presentation. As you mentioned, there's some really great synergy between what Sharon and Ruslana shared and what you've just presented. I'll open the floor for some comments or questions, reactions.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing this. I think it was just a really great to see this level of analysis, because it really supports the work that needs to be done in terms of what teachers need to think about and what they need to spend their time with. And so thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll also point out to the crowd what will now be available as a recorded presentation. The session that was held right before this really analyzed language patterns in the media. And interestingly, a lot of what you're discussing about historical recounts that children encounter in classrooms tracks with language choices that show up in media accounts of events as well. And so it's just really exciting for me to think about how language instruction at the elementary level can help children become more savvy consumers of news, because that is a topic of global interest, it seems, based on where the presenters are doing work on that topic.
Catherine, whose presentation was it? I want to make sure I write it down and check it out.
There were actually 4 presentations on this topic.
Oh, wow.
It was session 1B this morning, I believe.
Okay.
So David Beauchamp and Sheena Gardner in the UK. Leanne Bartley was looking at a US context, Dr. Pham in Vietnam, and also a doctoral student in the University of Sfax, Tunisia.
This reminds me, and I also enjoyed your presentation, Natalia and Vanina, and the connection to the critical media literacy. and how to first make language visible and then take it further, and so that the children or students are not just producers of text, but critical consumers of text, and how SFL as a framework and a toolkit helps us make those patterns and those perspectives visible through very concrete, visible pieces, almost like materiality in it, a language. So it's, I'm looking forward to reading, listening to the sessions that I missed. Thanks.
I'll also just briefly give voice to Miriam's comment from the chat, who would add that these tools are also profitable, she believes, for college writing instruction, particularly for folks who are teaching in open access programs and co-requisite support. So Miriam, feel free to add on to that if you had other thoughts.
Hey, thanks. I would throw out there as well, so much of the things you all have said are things that are new to college writing instruction. And yet I think we could profit from them, because the students, and I was thinking in the first presentation in particular, those students who are being left out and who are being neglected by the curriculum are then funneled into, unfortunately here in the States anyway, into college programs where those trends continue. And I think we so often see them then floundering because they still do not have access to the linguistic tools, both for writing and for reading the kinds of texts that they're going to encounter. And much of our support is simply to say, we will encourage you, we will support you, but we as college instructors very often don't have this kind of analytical background in looking at specific language features to turn around and provide them very clear linguistic support. So I'm excited about what I've learned today, and I'm hoping to share it at a school where there is absolutely no systemic functional linguistics at all. So I'm hoping that this can be the start of something. So I thank you both for what I've learned so much. I've been soaking it up.
And Miriam, thank you for that. There are quite a few higher education SFL scholars who are teaching writing at the college level using systemic functional linguistics. Nigel Kaplan, Michael Mahoney, Sylvia Pessoa, Ryan, I'm blanking on the last name, but lots of really useful, and Jennifer Walsh-Marr and Jody
Yes.
Martin. Yeah, so I hope their presentations focused more on your context.
Right. Thank you. I have made a list today. Unfortunately, none of this scholarship has made its way to my institution, but I'm hoping that I can introduce some of it.
Yeah, you can be the start.
Well, I know we also have Jennifer Green here in the audience, and not to put her on the spot, but who's trying to work with pre-service teachers around some of these ideas as well. And so if any of the presenters have thoughts to share about the pre-service context, I imagine that would be interesting to her as well as myself.
Oh, absolutely. I'm loving these presentations because I'm just like, oh, I could, all the things I can share and think about how, and the things that my students struggle with, right? Pre-service teachers, they went through their educational experiences without learning explicit language things. So I'm still having to explain what a preposition is and all those things in order to get into how do you identify circumstances. So anyway, this is, I'm eating all this up, so thank you.
Well, with that kind of enthusiastic feedback from the audience, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit more now. Would you share your second presentation with us, Natalia and Vanina?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so hello again. And the title of this second presentation is a realization of causal relations in historical accounts in primary school texts. And The outline of this presentation is the following. We'll start with the statement of the problem, and then we'll go through the objectives, the theoretical framework, and the methodology. We'll continue with the findings and discussions, and finally with the contributions and implications of this study. So as we have been discussing, understanding and producing texts in different genres is essential for primary school students. And one of the genres that students are expected to handle at primary school is historical accounts. And the key feature of this type of text is causal relations. These relations can be expressed through various linguistic resources, or they can be left implicit. So what motivated this study is the difficulty that many students face to identify implicit causal relations, which hinders students' understanding of the gist of this type of text. So this paper aims to provide a detailed analysis of explicit and implicit cause and effect relations in 6 historical accounts of a 5th grade primary school textbook that is frequently used in the province of Córdoba, Argentina. And we also want to contribute to the understanding of historical accounts by analyzing the choices made in relation to causal connections, which is expected to facilitate the design of teaching materials. Well, this study is theoretically anchored in the main tenets of SFL and genre theory. And as we all know, systemic functional linguistics views language as a system of choices through which language users can express different types of meanings in context. And well, we have adopted the definition of genre by Martin, who defines genre as a staged, goal-oriented social process. And the historical account genre is a type of historical narrative whose overall purpose is to explain historical events. And our analysis follow the definition of causality by Halliday as a relation of enhancement in which one clause expands another by embellishing around it. And causality includes reason, purpose, and behalf. And based on this definition, we have identified the different realizations of causality. So causality can be expressed as experientially, logical, or textually, and causality as an experiential meaning can be analyzed as an element of the transitivity system, as a process, generó, provoked, or as a participant, explanations, or as a circumstance. Debido a los gastos, so due to the expenditure. And the realization of causality as logical meanings, in this case, those realizations were identified between ranking clauses paratactically or hypotactically related by means of a linker or a binder. So, para qué, which in English would be in order that, there is a binder that introduces the dependent clause. And causality as a realization of textual meaning was analyzed in the conjunctive adjuncts between independent clauses that are not structurally related. So, entonces, therefore, in English, is a conjunctive adjunct that introduces the independent clause. And here we have a summary of the categories that we have used for the analysis. So we have the realization of causal relations as experiential, logical, and textual meanings. Regarding the methodology, we have selected, as I said before, 6 historical accounts of a 5th grade primary school textbook, and then we identify causal relations and we classify them into explicit or implicit, and also according to their subtype, reason and result, purpose, and behalf. And then with explicit causal relations, we analyzed their realization.
All right, now we are going to move on to the findings and discussion. Our analysis showed that the most frequent subtype of cause was the type of cause and result, which is characteristic of, or it reflects the genre, the historical account, since reason and cause typically follow chronologically. By contrast to purpose and behalf, which do not necessarily have a chronological relation. Then in terms of the realization, we found that the most frequent realization was within the system of taxes, then followed by experiential realizations, that is especially in particular circumstances. And then that was followed by both implicit cases and the realization of causality as cohesive links. Now we are going to illustrate this with some examples. First, we can look at the cases which have been highlighted in yellow in this extract from a text about the independence of the United States. So in yellow, we can see some examples of cause which are not expressed as cost, but in a different way. For example, in the first case, we have un gran descontento entre los colonos quienes pidieron formar parte del Parlamento británico. Quienes pidieron formar parte del Parlamento británico, who requested to be part of the British Parliament. So this cause is expressed as a non-defining relative clause. So this seems to be additional information, and students may not realize that this is also the cause of the previous nominalization, un gran descontento. And then we can see another case of implicit, we can see another case of an implicit case of causality, in which a part of the text, a fines de 1773, los colonos abordaron algunos barcos británicos que estaban en el puerto y arrojaron el cargamento de té al mar. In this case, this clause is juxtaposed, just follows the previous clause, the previous sentence, which realizes the cause, and the second is the effect. Okay, but the marker which has been fronted here is the time adverbial. So students may believe that these two events are only related in time, and they may not focus on the causality relation. Then we have some cases of the transitivity system here. For example, the case of generó in red, which has been highlighted in red. This case, generó, provocó, provoked, is a material process that shows a relation between the previous sentence, which is packed in a demonstrative pronoun, esto, and the predicate, un gran descontento entre los colonos, which is a nominalized adjective. So students have to unpack and retrieve information from different sentences, and they have to reconstruct all the participants in these cases. Then we also have a case of a cohesive link, entonces, and cases of circumstances. The circumstances have been highlighted in green. Here we have some cases of prepositional phrases debido a los grandes gastos que había provocado una guerra contra Francia ante las protestas en las colonias en respuesta a esta provocación. So in these cases, when we have prepositional phrases, they usually include also cases of nominalizations. So students also need to unpack these situations into complete figures and reconstruct all the participants. We have another example here. In this case, we have a cohesive link, por eso, and then in orange, we have the case of taxis. In the system of taxis, the most typical realization was cases of parataxis, or hypotaxis. So in this case, para que los británicos pudieran comerciar legalmente con nuestro territorio, is a clause that expresses purpose, and the preposition para with the subordinator que are joined together, and well, this could roughly be equivalent to the English in order that, right? So in this case, the clause includes all the participants, and the cause is a complete figure, so it is easier for the students to understand and retrieve the complete figure. In the case of Spanish, this para qué is very unambiguous, so it is straightforward, a case of purpose, right? Then we also have here alguna otra razón in purple. This has been highlighted in purple, and alguna otra razón shows cause as a participant in the clause. In this case, the existent. And this was the only case of cause as a participant. But it was also a very difficult case for students to understand, because it is part of a question that joins two different paragraphs in the text. So students have to analyze what they have already read and compare to what comes next. Well, and then we have another case in yellow of implicit causality. In this case, again, we have a non-defining relative clause which describes the antecedent, and it also explains the reason why the situation in the main clause took place. Okay, in this table, we have included some of the typical markers of a cause in the texts we have analyzed. And we haven't found any cases of behalf. That's why there aren't any markers of that here. And well, this only includes the explicit realizations, of course. And this could be thought of as a climb of integration into the structure, because those which are those cases of causality which are part of experiential meanings are usually integrated within the clause, and that means that they put on more difficulties for the students in terms of the demands for understanding. When causality is expressed as a textual or as a logical or part of the logical structure, then in those cases, the most frequent case is that all the participants are expressed congruently and explicitly. And well, and generally they are chronologically expressed. Now, as regards the contributions and implications of this study, Well, the historical accounts studied construe causal relations through strategies ranging from the most explicit to the most implicit, which poses heavy demands on comprehension. Students need to be able to deal with a range of different structures, and they have to retrieve meaning from all those different structures. And they also need to be able to handle them and express and produce them. The expression of cause within the clause as an element of the transitivity system requires the reader to unpack figures, moving backward and forward in the text to find the reference, to retrieve the information compressed in abstract and technical terms. Sometimes the full unpacking of figures depends on access to background information, which the nominalizations have left out, and the tracking of participants whose preferences are ambiguous. The recognition of some strategies deployed to imply causality, juxtaposition, non-defining relative clauses is vital for the local link between the events and for the construction of the line of reasoning, since students have to make a chain of events, and sometimes if one part of that chain is lost, the complete understanding of the line of reasoning is difficult. Students should be trained to acquire the strategies which facilitate the comprehension of causal links in historical accounts, and therefore read and write efficiently in the disciplines. These are the references, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you again to the two of you for building on the rich discussions that we've had so far. We have time for a bit more discussion in this section. So I wonder who would like to kick things off for us. Ruslana, I see you off mute. Would you like to begin?
Sure. I was just connecting to Jennifer Walsh-Marr's presentation on, and I think Jody was there too. I was viewing it after they are presented. And Pomp and Circumstance, their work that they published about and presented about on how circumstances at a certain point, it's important to not just to identify and to act, but to also look at what job they're doing in the text. And I liked seeing their examples and connected to your work of how circumstances sometimes actually present a particular opinion or perspective, even though we think to look for perspective in appraisal system, sometimes circumstances also communicate a perspective or a particular attitude. And so I'm thinking of if you've explored that next level of sort of discourse semantics, the meaning beyond the clause work, and how, what functions they're serving, and how students are engaging with this work.
We haven't studied that yet, but while we were doing our analysis, we found cases, for example, of was there any other reason, like that question in the middle of a text, which was clearly showing some, well, bias, let's say, and well, challenging the veracity of what came before. I don't know, but we would certainly like to continue studying that in the future.
Hi, I wanted to ask Natalia and Vanina, have you taken the work that you've done and applied it to kind of some detailed reading that that Rose has done? And I think it's just Rose, David Rose has done the stuff with a detailed reading. Have you explored, have you done that?
Yes. Actually, we worked with circumstances, with the identification of circumstances, and with the questions, who can see in the first line the answer to the question, for example, who won the battle of such and such, and the students have to name the person of that. Do you mean that? Yes, those guided questions so that students can identify the keywords that will help them later on to understand the content and to be able to rewrite the text. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was just connecting it to Jennifer, your work with pre-service teachers. So I did some similar stuff where having teachers do some transitivity analysis like the one we saw in this presentation, and then connected that to asking comprehension questions. And because I think what I really like about these two presentations that we just saw was that implicit and explicit connection to reading comprehension. Obviously, the transitivity analysis gives us that what are the language demands of the text, which is super critical, and then connecting that to supporting reading comprehension. So that's something, Jennifer, you could consider, and obviously making it not as technical as it was done here for the pre-service teachers. But I've done it like really basic, like where's the process, where's the participant, where's the circumstance, and then teaching teachers to ask questions based on that knowledge. And it really gets them to focus on the text and to figure out, again, what are the language demands of the text? Why would this then be difficult to comprehend? And so that's something that I think is really powerful and fun to do with teachers.
Yes, and because while you do that, at the same time, you can elaborate on certain items or on certain concepts that students need to understand, so as to be able to understand the whole text. Yes, so we do both things at the same time, the detailed reading plus then the we work on those concepts that need further explanation, let's say.
And while you do the detailed reading with students, you realize that sometimes they understand things in a different way. And so then it is clear to the teacher what the student, how he came to that understanding or comprehension or the problems he's going through.
I have a COVID question for all the presenters. Something that I noticed in my context is that as the pandemic has stretched on, there's like just a general fatigue among pre-service and in-service teachers that I'm working with. And sometimes it means bringing to the work like an extra enthusiasm on our part as like the language people about this kind of language work. And I'm just curious if any of you have experienced something of like a fatigue resistance to this, and how, just practically, how you're responding to that.
I can respond. Sorry, I keep clicking too many times and there is a lag. I was actually encouraged by a teacher with whom I did some of this work but didn't publish about it, is that how she, because SFL gave her a really useful toolkit to see language and attend to language needs of her students in the year of pandemic, that's how 2020 was. Back then, she was sharing with me how that toolkit just stayed with her. You don't just leave it for the physical classroom where students are with you and you can walk around and check on them, but how that toolkit sort of gave her a framework for developing and continuing to develop students' language resources in Zoom classrooms. So yes, there was Zoom fatigue. At the same time, she was saying that the toolkit gave me tools to bring into the Zoom classroom. So I was very encouraged because I worked with teachers in physical classrooms before COVID, and then I was wondering how that work would carry forward. So I was encouraged to see science explanations and third and fourth graders exploring the reasoning behind particular concepts and phenomena in the science classroom, and the disciplinary literacy of how they were answering questions like, why does glass shatter when it falls on the ground? And so it in that case, that work continued. So it's just kind of a secondary experience that I was that I'm sharing, not that I was there.
I think definitely fatigue of both learning Zoom and just sort of this languishing like feeling is going on. And also we're now back 60% face-to-face on campus, like in general. About 60% of classes are being held face-to-face. And so my face-to-face class, my students are very happy to be back in class. And like one of the key differences is the ability to talk, because on Zoom, like two of you can't turn to each other to get that clarification, or there's less of a feeling to be able to ask questions. And I feel like during Zoom University that the deeper, like they learned SFL in my class, because my entire class on academic languages through the SFL lens. But it's so like dense and there's so much to teach in 10 weeks that I'm glad we're going back face to face, because I just feel like the conversations and the ability to dig is just, it's not impossible on Zoom, but it's much easier face to face.
I have another question also about reading to learn and what the uptake process was like for the two of you in getting that into schools or the contexts where you're working also. I know some educators in the States kind of feel like they have to make a hard sell up against some other packaged curricular products and things like that. So I just wondered a little about your experience working with reading to learn and bringing that into schools.
Well, we are part of a bigger group, and we don't teach at primary school, but we found some teachers who do, and we managed, because of different connections in the team members, to convince them to try it out. So different workshops were carried out for them to get acquainted with the program, and then some of us went to the schools and worked on the texts that they were going to use to teach through this methodology, and then some of their classes were filmed as well, and then we watched the recordings and gave them some feedback too. And well, this year we expect to develop a workshop to include more teachers within this program.
That sounds so familiar to me, as kind of how many folks in our SFL education community are kind of like evangelizing, I guess, is that right? The right way, working with our collaboration groups and teachers that we know, and then kind of spreading organically like that.
Exactly, yes.
I'm curious, sort of follow up on Catherine's question about, because reading to learn and the teaching and learning cycle, the sort of the visible language pedagogies, they are sort of in conflict with discovery learning and explicit and the teacher role of doing language teaching explicitly. We have sort of like a philosophical conflict, I think, with that. And I just wanted to hear if you've had experiences where the teacher as doing the job of actually teaching the language resources for participating in disciplinary literacies and in critical literacies. If in your context that is up against some other discovery or constructivist pedagogies where the role of the teacher is more secondary, and exploration and discovery is where the learning should be happening. If there is, if you've made observations about that in your context.
Well, actually, as we said before, actually we don't teach in primary schools or not in secondary schools, but what we have noticed with the teachers we have worked with and in the workshops and while observing classes is that, well, you know, that preparing the text and all the questions and the preparation before the reading, it's very time consuming, so that it's kind of new for the teachers. And at the beginning, there is kind of resistance to do that because they are used to a different approach to the texts. But then we found that after adopting this methodology with certain texts in the units, they were really satisfied with the results of the students, and they were eager to use the pedagogy, the reading to learn again in the following years. So it proved to be successful, and the teachers were really satisfied with the results. I don't know if I have answered the question or not.
Yes. Yeah, the first there is resistance, and yeah, we found the same, right, Sharon, in the paper that we're going to write on the literary and theme interpretation essay. We found the same, that at first there was resistance, like, why aren't kids writing? Because they're learning the language resources from the teacher, and the teacher is teaching. And so we found the same resistance at first.
Yes, and as you were saying in your presentation, I listened that sometimes teachers teach with a spoken mode, and then they want students to express that content in the written mode, and that transition needs to be explicitly taught and worked on. So, well, that process in the middle can be has been proved to be successful with the Reading to Learn program. So they are happy in the end to know the program, because they, well, at least with the 3 schools that we have worked with, they didn't know anything about this pedagogy. So,
well, we also had resistance from the students too. So particularly with that prepare move that you do when you're summarizing the part of the text before you explicitly reference that, because the students were so used to being able to, they didn't want to know what was going to happen in the text, like that was giving it away for them. And so during this study that Ruslan and I did, we would ask for feedback from the students every day after so we actually went in and taught these lessons, and we'd ask for feedback. And that was one of the main things that students were very frustrated by. But of course, the ones that were frustrated were the white middle class students who were used to that and didn't sort of need that. And the kids that were not complaining were our English language learners, who seemed to really value that. So that was an interesting kind of thing that we noticed. And so it's good to hear some positive uptake of the Reading to Learn in Argentina.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, Jen, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the resistance, it's also within higher ed, because many of my colleagues not in SFL are very much in sort of the teacher is the guide on the side versus the sage on the stage, I think is how they always frame it. And it should always be exploratory, and the teacher's not Meg Gebhardt has a really good book, and I can't remember, I don't have it with me, it's at home, but chapter 3, I think it is, compares kind of like the behaviorist and then the middle and then the Holidaylian versions of sort of views on language acquisition. And many people are still kind of in that middle spot where, yeah, the teacher isn't as responsible for that explicit teaching. And yes, that's the one. Thank you.
Ruslan is showing
Yes.
the book.
Yes, that's the book. I love that book. And anyway, so it's just sort of also like they come into our classes and we're talking about like explicit instruction in authentic ways with, you know, real text, obviously. And, but it always feels like a little bit of conflict with sort of what they're learning in other classes.
And Jennifer, can I ask too, since you're also in higher ed, do you also see some resistance overall, perhaps from some other colleagues to even the notion that you would be doing the grammar? I am getting some pushback that it's sort of given as a commonplace that grammar cannot help writing instruction.
Yeah.
And yeah. And it's a really interesting pushback.
It is.
To get that notion, and also from some comp prep folks, because I'm actually in an English department, not an ed department.
Yeah.
So I'm getting some interesting feedback sometimes from folks in the comp prep side about the whole notion of what grammar is, and also they mean something different by genre than I do, or genre-based pedagogies. So that there's also a lot of terminology that creates issues for discussions.
Absolutely, yeah. Our English department, they don't do like explicit focus on language, so you know, grammar like is very, very small. Yeah, it's more of like you should just use the language and you'll figure it out, sort of. That sense of what's right should be in your heart, I guess. I don't know. So
I think Jen, thanks for bringing up Meg's chapter of that particular table where she describes Skinner, Chomsky, and Halliday, and the critiques of all three approaches and the affordances, I guess. But I think this conversation about the uselessness of grammar in teaching is because of the history of how grammar was taught. And so Meg, again, in her book, digs into the details of that history and why grammar has received such bad reputation, and how a lot of the repair of that damage needs to be done in order to position grammar as a meaning-making resource. So I think Derevyanka and Jones, no, I think it was just Bev Derevyanka's chapter, or sorry, a free open access article, moving from traditional to functional, is where she does a nice job of bridging the two, because we can't really make friends if we create dichotomies. But when you bridge the traditional through from grammar as you know, an inventory of rules to grammar as a meaning-making resource, then you can sort of, you need to have that conversation about why the bad reputation and how we can move beyond in productive ways. So I've been thinking about the same thing too, because it's a very hard sell to bring back grammar, but it has to be done through language as a resource for meaning making, and acknowledging the historical context that was very, I would say, detrimental.
I love the bridge metaphor. Thank you. It's a great way to think about it.
It's from Bev Derevyanka. I can't own it, but she forced me to think through about bridging and not dichotomizing, but bridging is helpful.
Friends, we could talk a lot longer. I have a feeling, but maybe we should take this opportunity for a pause to get a bit of a lunch break. There are afternoon sessions coming, including a live discussion opportunity with folks who pre-recorded talks, including Jen here, whose link to her talk with Beth Dillard, who's in the chat there, and Lucia's talk is pre-recorded as well, so you can go check that out, some other really great ones. I'm going to click stop record now.